Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my NACL Week 3 overview, analysis, and of course, at the end, my updated power rankings video. Incredibly excited to go over the NACL this week. There are so many competitive teams in the NACL, and I know I've said it basically every single week on this channel, and if you only watch these videos, you're probably annoyed and tired of hearing it by now, but this really is my favorite region to cover in the world. The games are the most fun to watch, the players are the most fun to track in terms of storylines and just in terms of the way that they carry themselves. It still very much has that feel of amateur, but in a way that, you know, a lot of these players really are fantastic. It's the skill level of LCS with the production and fun player dynamics of, you know, a lot of the grassroots tournaments that I think we all kind of fell in love with for esports in the first place. And so really like covering the NACL, and this week was certainly no different. But let me know down in the comment section below what you guys thought of the NACL here in week number 3. What teams are impressing you? What teams are not impressing you right now? Would love to know you guys' thoughts and feedback down below. But of course, it's time to get into the games. What we do here on this channel is go over all 3 days of action in a little scoreboard type setting. We're going to be going over all 5 games on each day, talking about a player of the game or a player of the series, a dud of the series, and then at the end of the week, I'll be giving you my updated power rankings after week number 3, as well as a player of the week and a dud of the week for the entire week here in the NACL. So without further ado, let's just jump right into the action. We get to kick off, of course, Week 3 with day number 1. And day 1 had a lot of really interesting games. A lot more 2-0s than I think we're used to this split in particular, where there's really been a lot of 1-1 draws. But this week, in general, I think that there were a lot more definitive series than we kind of got used to over the beginning part of the split. And we get to kick that off with our first series of the first bracket, that being Team Fish Taco taking on Evil Geniuses Challengers. And Taco picking up a 2-0 series win here. Evil Geniuses worryingly kind of starting to fall into the same kind of trend that they were in towards the back half of last split as well, where they started off relatively fine. This team had a ton of talent, but as the other teams got better, they just kind of stayed stagnant, and it looks to be a similar case here. I'm really worried about the consistency of the top side of the map for them, but congratulations to Taco. This was a phenomenal series from them, and they continue to look a lot better than anybody could have basically ever expected them to here. Player of the series for me, pretty obviously, going to go to Lunacia in the top lane. When he wins, he just wins so freaking hard, and that's why people are super high on him in the North American scene. There's a reason that he's been getting hype as like the next big NACL top laner after, you know, after presumably Bradley and maybe even Fake God get another shot at the LCS. Lunacia is kind of next in line to be able to be that guy here, and these are the games that kind of show you why. He bought Medjai's on Olaf, for Christ's sake, in game number 2, because he was just that far ahead. That's how strong he was in this game. So Lunacia absolutely dominating. Onat has also been really good for this team in the mid lane. I was really surprised with how consistent he's been in the laning phase. That really wasn't something that I was expecting for a young mid laner to be, or I guess an inexperienced mid laner to be able to do at the NACL level, but he's been a great laner. He's been a really good team fighter for this team, and honestly has been a major reason why they've been so much better than I think I gave them credit for at the beginning of the split. They've been consistently able to beat teams that are ahead of them in terms of, you know, perception and talent level and whatever you want to say, right? Because Onat has been stepping up, and obviously Lunacia and Spawn are both really good players, and we highlighted them in the pre-split process, but Onat being as good as he has been is a big reason why Taco is actually one of the scarier teams in the league to have to face basically on any given day. But Lunacia, Onat definitely stepping up. Everybody else was also good. I think Spawn continues to be a really solid player, and, you know, he's definitely very, very good for this level. I saw some comments about him, you know, being one of those players that's too good for the NACL, but not good enough for the LCS, and I don't necessarily agree with that sentiment. I think the situation on Dignitas was about perfect for him to be as bad as possible. He's not a player that's going to push a ton of advantages. He's not very aggressive. He's not really this big resource carry. He's just a very consistent, especially in the teamfight stage, AD carry. I compare him to someone like Patrick over in the LEC, and I think that's a relatively fair comparison. I think that he was just given too much responsibility on that Dignitas team, and he really wasn't able to come up. I think if you have some more aggressive players instead of Jensen, who's more of a passive player, Santorin, who's more of a passive player, Armud, who's more of a passive player, if you put more aggressive players around him, I still think he could be good at the LCS level, but Taco surprisingly kind of running through their solo lanes, at least in this series, and I think it looked really good. And then for Evil Geniuses, they're just kind of struggling for consistency, and it's not the players that you would hope that would, be the problem. You would hope that it's the veterans that are the problem. You would hope that Ryoma would be having bad games. You would hope that King is having bad games because you want to see the development out of your younger players, but it really is the top side of the map that has not really been able to hold up. We'll talk about Shaden in a second. He was kind of good in this series. He was up and down, I would say, definitely aggressive and was creating plays, but was also giving over a ton of resources. But Soul in the top lane kind of just got run over, and it's unfortunate to say. I like Soul. He's going to be my dud of the series. I still think he can continue to get better, but it really does feel like he has taken some steps back on Evil Geniuses, and that's definitely frustrating. This is an organization that has been known for generating the best out of their talent, and I think you could argue they've been doing the exact opposite all year long with both Soul and Shaden. They're two big prospects, and so Shaden being okay in this series and Soul not so much, it definitely stands out. Someone like Smoothie really wasn't all that good in this series either. Like I said, Ryoma and King were definitely doing something, but it certainly wasn't enough to be able to win. But top lane was a pretty big gap, unfortunately. And I want to give the credit to Taco instead of talking about how bad Evil Geniuses was, because I think, obviously, Lunacia was really, really good in this series, and if he's going to be able to play like that, this team's going to be more than fine. And then moving on to our second of our first bracket of games here, we had a matchup between Supernova and FlyQuest Challengers that ends up being a 1-1 draw, and this is definitely in favor of Supernova, a team that I think a lot of people are really looking towards to kind of start stepping up their games. They've been relatively inconsistent towards the start of the split. I think that there are a couple of teams that really just haven't shown as much as maybe we would want to see from them at the beginning of the split, and Supernova has definitely had some good series, but they've also had some pretty bad series as well, so to see them be able to take a game off of FlyQuest, who a lot of people consider to be one of the best teams in the entire league, is a very good thing. And there continues to be some problems with FlyQuest that are definitely worth pointing out because the consistency with this team continues to be a question mark, but they still look good in particular areas, and a lot of that being in the bot lane, which is still a major positive for this team overall. And honestly, just kind of the macro of FlyQuest, I think, has been pretty solid, especially from ahead. When you look at this game number one, pretty obvious to see where their advantages are coming from. Player of the series for me is going to go to Winsome in the support position. I still think he's the best support in the NACL by a considerable margin, and I think series like this kind of show why. His ability to engage and be a primary initiator, especially for a lot of the aggressive plays that FlyQuest want to go for, is completely invaluable to this team. This team can sometimes lack a little bit of purpose towards the back half of the game, and so Winsome just being that go button, I think has really helped them out a lot. He's really, really good for this team, and he's been good. I think, obviously, Masu is still good. He's not been the game wrecker that I thought he would be coming into this split, honestly. He's been a little bit less impressive than he was in spring, but it's still early, and obviously, there are a lot of contributing factors as to why someone might not be the best player in the entire league, guaranteed, but he's still winning lane super consistently. He's still been a very good AD carry. I just was looking for a little bit better than very good. Maybe the expectations were just a little bit too high for someone who is technically still a rookie going into this split. And then Yuji has also been like a major positive, I would say, for FlyQuest over the course of this entire year. His aggressive tendencies have really helped this team in the early to mid game, I think, a lot, and him and Winsome have very good chemistry in terms of the plays that they want to make, alongside Masu, of course, that really kind of create a lot of offense for FlyQuest. I think it's the ancillary pieces that haven't exactly been the most, I guess, interesting to me and confidence boosting throughout the entire split up until this point, but Yuji, Winsome, Masu, I think, have been more than positive. And then, unfortunately, I've got to give dud of the series to someone on FlyQuest as well, and it's going to go to Spirax, who, I hate to say it, has really not been all that good this split, in my opinion. It's been a little bit of a weakness for this team. He continues to get a little bit bodied in lane. Not bodied, I should say, but, he's not winning lane phases, and I do think it's a little bit of a problem for FlyQuest. He gives over a lot of pressure in specific matchups, and I think he's very meta-dependent, and I think when you're looking at FlyQuest, if they want to be one of the best teams in the entire league, Spirax is going to need to step up and be significantly more consistent than he has been over the beginning part of this split. I also don't think Faisal has exactly been the guy that we all were promised at the beginning of the split. Loved him for Fear, and he was really a big playmaker for them. He's kind of just been a guy on FlyQuest, which is unfortunate, but hopefully the two solo laners can step it up, because I do think jungle and bot lane have been a positive, and, if everything can come together, they can still be the best team in the league, but there are more question marks than I think we originally gave them credit for. And then for Supernova on the other side, a couple of good plays and a couple of bad plays as well. I would say in general they were the less interesting team in this series. They were still really good in Game 2, but I think a lot of the form was kind of dictated by what FlyQuest was able to do, and the difference between Game 1 and 2 really wasn't all that big for me. It really was the difference between FlyQuest in the first and second game that I think created a lot of the advantages. The player that I would really want to highlight on the side of Supernova is Trevor in the support position, who again I thought was really good. I thought both supports were actually really good in this series, and definitely the big creators for their team, but even someone like Robbie Bob had a good game in the mid lane in their win, wasn't quite as good in their loss, but, you know, I would say back and forth stuff. You know, someone like Music, I think, had a relatively decent series. If I had to point out a negative for this team, I want to see Sketch do a little bit more with the resources that he's given in the bot lane, but it's really not that big of a deal. I still think he's a good player, and he's been good up until this point this split, but Supernova very much felt like the team that we all kind of expected them to be in this series. This was more about FlyQuest for me, being both the best and the worst team in this series at different given moments, and so you're kind of hoping that they can get some consistency down because they should be one of the best teams in the league. And then moving on to our second slate of games here, and kicking us off with our third game of day one, we had a matchup between Wildcard Gaming and Team Liquid Challengers that TLC is able to take the 2-0 win in, and this team just continues to look phenomenal. This is their 5th 2-0 win on the year in 7 series. It's just unreal how consistent this team has been over the beginning part, and I know, you know, there are a lot of takes that don't age well on this channel, but I would say that there are way more takes that do age well, and this is one that I think has aged incredibly well so far, and that was Team Liquid being the best team in the NACL. I expected that going into the split. I didn't really see a lot of other people with that opinion. Not to say it was like super unpopular. People were saying they were guaranteed a top 3 team, but I pretty often saw them at 3rd, and I kind of went out on a limb and said they're going to be the most consistent team by a considerable margin, and I'm really glad to see that that has come into fruition, especially with, we'll talk about some of the other teams kind of near them a little bit soon, but TL has been awesome, and it's everybody on the team. It's not one particular member. Everybody's been stepping up. Player of the series here is going to go to Bradley in the top lane. Top laner is kind of making some noise in day number 1 here. Really, really fun to see him. Honestly, just got to give a big shout out to Bradley with everything going on in his life right now. For him to have, for him to still be as good as he is, and quite frankly, be having one of the best splits he's ever had so far, it's just insane. You got to give him a ton of credit. He is the premier top lane prospect in the NACL, in my opinion. You can say what you want about Fake God, who has also been phenomenal, but like those are the 2 best top laners in the NACL, and it's not particularly close. In my eyes, Bradley has been really, really good for this team, and he really crushed Zamudo, who's actually been a really good player across this split so far, and then the rest of this team is also playing well. APA continues to be an MVP candidate for me, even though he did stumble a little bit more in week 2 than maybe he did in week 1, and Arrow has been, like, surprisingly consistent. Not that I expected him to be bad, but he was someone who, at his best, had good games and then also had bad games, was very dependent on the rest of the team. But I guess if you're dependent on the rest of the team and the rest of the team is playing as good as Team Liquid has been playing with how good Mir is in the jungle, Kim Down's been solid, like Arrow's going to continue to look good. And so your 3 big kind of laners, I guess, looking really good in this series and definitely being the standouts for Team Liquid. And then for Wildcard on the other side, they're just not able to hold up to Team Liquid. I actually think this team is still pretty good. They looked really good over the course of week number 2, which gave me a lot of confidence in them, but TL is a little bit of a different beast than basically everybody else that they went up against. Dud of the series is going to go to Zamudo. Hate giving it to Zamudo in the top lane because I actually really like him as a player, and I think he's been pretty good for this team up until this point, but top side of the map for TL is just so ridiculous, and Zamudo, unfortunately, was kind of on the receiving end of a Bradley beatdown in this series. He's going to be fine. I expect him to be able to bounce back relatively well, but a rough series for him, and I think this was easily Keel's worst series of the year up until this point. If you follow the channel, you know I'm ridiculously high on Keel as a player for Wildcard. I think he's crazy consistent and a very positive player for them overall, and unfortunately, this was one of the few series where he just wasn't able to really make an impact and was honestly a little bit of a detriment to the team, and I think that's going to be okay, right? Going up against Mir, a player who's been very good at being able to strangle out resources from his opponent. Keel just it wasn't his day, and it's going to happen every once in a while. I still have a lot of faith in this Wildcard team to be able to turn it around because it was the good players that struggled and not like the bot lane getting exploited, which is something that I was actually a little bit worried about. But overall, Wildcard is still a team that I would expect to be relatively fine moving into the rest of these, weeks. But TL is just on a different planet right now. They're the best team in the NACL by a large margin. Pretty much every single game, they continue to prove that. And then moving on to our 4th series here in our second series of the second bracket, we had a matchup between Maryville University and Disguise DSG. That was a 1-1 draw, and man, DSG is just never going to be able to escape the 1-1 Dignitas Challengers allegations, are they? This is so familiar to me to what we saw in spring, although Dignitas, I think, looked a little bit more consistent in the way that they were able to play games, but talk about a team that just can't figure out how to 2-0 to save their lives, and they should be the better team in series like this. Unfortunately for them, though, I think you could make the argument they were not the more consistent team across both of these games. Maryville was actually really good here, and that's something I think is really, really good to see. This team looks a ton better than they did in week 1, not only in this series, but they did in week 2 as well. And so a lot of positives to take away from them. And it's got to be spearheaded by a couple of players that I'm just really excited to see performing well. Player of the series for me is going to go to Get Back in the mid lane. And man, I'm excited to say that. I talked about this a lot in week number 1 when he was really struggling in that mid lane, where I was like, I'm really just hoping that it's like early nerves or that he just needs to get used to this level. It's very hard to move up a tier. It's very hard to be immediately impactful moving up a tier, especially when the rest of the players around you aren't exactly the most experienced in the entire world. And so I wanted to give Get Back some time to be able to get his footing under him. And I really do think that he has finally hit that point. He was really good in week 2. Maybe not like a superstar. He was definitely more up and down, but he was phenomenal in this game as well. And so a lot to take away. He was simply the better mid laner across this entire series, and that's really, really good to see. If Get Back can step up and be good, that's big for Maryville. And then Odd Orange has been by far the best player for Maryville across their early part of the split here. He's actually been really good in the jungle, consistently able to generate early leads for the team and then translate that to the rest of the lanes. Most of the time, it's been to Niles in the top lane. This team really likes to play towards the top side of the map, but we talked about it a lot. Get Back also gets a lot of those, favors, I would say, in the mid lane as well. This team likes to play towards that top side of the map, and I think the solo laners are definitely the ones that kind of get a little bit more favoritism because of it, but Odd Orange has been the big kind of facilitator for them, and a big reason why I think this team looks as good as they do. So jungle mid, really looking positive, and then Zyko. I really like Zyko, and he continues to look very good in the bot lane. Scary Jerry's been a little bit up and down, has looked good against, lesser competition, the worst teams in the league, but I think that Zyko has really consistently, been solid, maybe outside of a lot of what we saw in week number 1, and so some good things for Maryville, especially considering the fact that I don't think Niles and Jerry are weak links by any means. It's just a really good sign that this team was able to take a game off of Disguised and look pretty competitive in game 2 as well. And then for Disguised, come on, you just got to get more consistent. There really is nothing else to say about this team. For you not to be able to take both of these games is just not good, and it's not even the fact that you lost one, it's the fact that you got absolutely demolished in game number 1. Everybody played miserable in game number 1. You could basically give the dud of the series to all of DSG in game number 1, but I'm going to give it to Young in the mid lane. It was the most noticeable in the mid lane to see the outclassing. That game 1 from him was just completely miserable, and Young's going to have games like this. He had a couple on Golden Guardians last split as well, but I still think for the most part he's going to be fine. I just need to see the consistency of everybody on this team step up. Meech was pretty good in game number 2, and if you're going to get more consistently great performances out of Meech, that's going to be great, but Meech, a notoriously inconsistent player from game to game, can have some phenomenal games, can also have some games where he's relatively irrelevant. Zeyzal really wasn't doing all that much in this series, and I think you could definitely make the case that Tomio wasn't as good as Odd Orange across this entire series, and so a lot of questionable things for Disguise. They should have been walking into this series feeling incredibly confident, but instead they got blasted in game number 1, and it still raises some question marks. I'm not going to be out on this team by any means, but I was already talking about them being a little bit less than the sum of their parts last week, and I think this only kind of enhances the narrative around that. And then for Maryville, like I said, they looked really good. You're going to be very happy being able to take a game off of DSG and honestly being able to keep up relatively well in game 2 as well. And so overall, you're pretty excited with their showing, but for Disguised, you just got to see more. If they want to be one of the best teams in the league, they need to consistently be able to take care of teams like Maryville. And then finally, we get to our final series of day number 1, and it's another one I'm excited to talk about. AoE Gold taking on Cincinnati Fear. And Fear pick up the 2-0 series win. Fear are back, baby. We talked about this in week number 2. It felt like they were really getting their groove back. All of these players were feeling confident and aggressive again, and that has absolutely translated into the beginning of week number 3 here, where they honestly just kind of slapped AoE. Game 2 was significantly closer, and there were definitely some moments where Will, in particular, was trying to pull the series back, but Fear looked phenomenal, basically across the board, and we're just going to give them their flowers, because this, again, looks like one of the best teams in the NACL, and it very much feels kind of like a similar story to Spring. If Evil Geniuses are the team in Spring that they were and, are starting to decline as the split goes on, Fear might be the team that ends up ramping a lot as we get further along into the split. But player for the series for me is going to go to Perry in the jungle. How can it not? That Kindred game was legitimately unbelievable. Of course, the rest of the team did a great job of being able to help him out, but when Perry gets going, he's Perry. Like, we've talked about him so much on this channel over the past year or so. He's just going to be almost impossible to stop with a lead, and that continues here, especially at the NACL level. Perry is someone who I think really could perform at a high level in the LCS, and the NACL is definitely not equipped to be able to handle him in positions where he's playing a champion that can just snowball the game out of control, like he did in game number 1. Although he was really good in game number 2 as well on the Vi. Like, I don't want to take away from the fact that he was super consistent across this entire series. He's just a really good player, and he plays off his team well. Shoji still continues to be the most consistent player on this team from game to game, not only setting up his jungler, but being able to win in lane himself. Just a really big positive for the team overall, and I really want to give a big shout out to Manui in the bot lane. 2 games of kind of weak side AP mage bot laners, Seraphine and Ziggs here, and he looked great on both of them. You could argue this was his best series of the year, and I think, or maybe of the split, maybe not of the year, but of the split. He was really, really good in this series, though, and you're really excited to see kind of the draft and the ideology that this team wants to go to. They understand kind of the way their personnel ends up working. Seraphine was a massive pick for Fear over the course of last split as well, so to see them pull it out here against AoE, it's not particularly surprising, but I like seeing the innovation that this team is able to go under, and I like seeing them, continue to play what they're good at rather than just trying to force what everything else is kind of doing. I think the top side is stabilized a ton. Perry and Shochi are one of the best jungle mid duos in the entire league, and this bot lane has been very consistent, especially on weak side, and so Fear looking very, very dangerous right now, like a top 4, maybe even higher than that team in the league. And then for AoE, it's just unfortunate this team has some major issues. They have some major positives as well. Will continues to be a really good player for this team, and he's still creating a lot of opportunities for them. They just don't really have a lot of other players that are going to be capitalizing on those. I don't think they played all that bad in this series, if I'm being entirely honest. The bot lane was relatively fine for them. I think Darkwing's had some negative moments in general, but, he also had some positive ones, and so I don't want to, over-hate on him, even if I think he's been way too inconsistent across this split so far. But done of the series for me is going to go to Concept in the top lane. It's not entirely his fault. He honestly feels more like a scapegoat here than anything else, but Concept has been a little bit rough to start this split, and this just goes back to his time on Golden Guardians Academy and Challengers over the past year or so, where he'll get into these ruts where he really just doesn't play well, where he doesn't create chances, where he's not really doing a lot for the team, and that was the case here. It just felt like he was the odd man out when it came to AoE Gold. The solo lanes in particular, I think, have been kind of shockingly bad. Like, you could have expected maybe Concept to struggle, but for Darkwings to struggle as much as he has at the beginning of the split, even with Will playing well, I think it's been disappointing to say the least, and I'm very quickly losing trust in this AoE team to be a top 5, top 6 team in the league. There are so many teams that show so many cool things across this entire week and across this entire split so far. AoE is starting to feel like the odd man out in a situation like that, which is unfortunate, but there still is a lot of talent on this team. There still is time for them to be able to figure it out. I just don't think it's worked in the way that I think a lot of people were hoping to start off Summer Split. But for Fear, they've really found their groove. They look phenomenal right now, and legitimately, like, they could be unstoppable. I know AoE's not exactly in the best of form, but for them to be able to come into this series and look as dominant as they did through their best players, it's just one of the things that I think you wanted to see the most coming out from Fear in week number 3. And then moving on now from day number 1 to day number 2 here in week 3 of the NACL. And our first bracket of games was kicked off with a matchup between AoE Gold and Team Liquid Challengers that TLC is able to take with a 2-0 series win. They continue their dominant start to the split, although this series was a lot closer, I think, than that scoreline would end up indicating. Game 1 in particular was a very nice win for Team Liquid that they really shouldn't have had. I mean, there were a lot of opportunities and circumstances in which I think worse teams would have lost that game very quickly, but they're just so incredibly talented, and it's so easy for them to be able to team fight consistently towards the back half of games that they were able to take that one. And then game 2 was significantly more clean from them, I would say, overall, but you really gotta thank the top side of this map. It feels like every single week there's one Team Liquid player in particular that we're pointing out, and this week it seems to be Bradley in the top lane, who's going to get my player of the series. He's been phenomenal for Team Liquid across this entire split, but a really good week for him so far. Was awesome in this series, going up against a player in Concept that I think he absolutely has the potential to be able to just take advantage of in a matchup like this. Really looked good, and if he's able to keep that up, like, he's going to be the best top laner in the league. No brainer. Fake God's definitely giving him a run for his money at the current moment, but Bradley is right there with him for that best role, and 19, 5, and 23, like, that almost undersells the impact that he was able to have on this series, especially on that Kennen in game number 2. Just really good stuff coming out from him, but it's basically everybody on Team Liquid that's been stepping up recently. APA is still having a phenomenal split. He's been great. Arrow has been great. Him and Kim Down have been really good in lane, and I think Mir is always going to be like one of the best facilitators in the entire league for what the rest of this team wants to do. And so Team Liquid just looking like the team that we think they should be and the team that they are. Really nothing else to say. We've kind of said it all when it comes to when it comes to Team Liquid. But for AoE, like, there's some good and some bad. You definitely held your own in game number 1, and I think that's a really big positive for this team overall. I think a player, especially in Dark Wings, looked really good in that first game, was really trying to do a lot to keep that game alive, but unfortunately AoE just struggled, especially down the stretch in terms of the team fighting stage of the game, and really that just goes to show the kind of player difference that I think there was between these two teams. My dud of the series is going to go to Will in the jungle. Probably his worst series as a jungler this split so far, just not really great, and that's kind of disappointing because he's been the most consistent member of AoE by a considerable margin. Maybe Breezy is in that regard as well. I think Breezy's had a very underratedly great start to the split, but Will has kind of been the one that's generating a lot of the leads for this team when they are able to win games, and so to see him play relatively poor this series is unfortunate. Yes, he's going into Mir, who again is a very good player, arguably the best jungler at this level, and so I certainly don't want to say that him getting outplayed in the series is a surprise, but I would have liked to see him be a little bit more, I don't know, clean when it comes to the game plan that he was trying to execute on, because it really just felt like he was kind of there. Like I said, though, Dark Wings looked relatively good in game 1, and I do think that there are some positives to take away from this, but AoE just felt like a team that was relatively out-muscled in this game, outmatched in this game, and that really has more to do with Team Liquid than it does with AoE. Team Liquid is just the best team in the entire league, and it's not particularly close at the current moment, and so you just got to give them their flowers. They're playing incredibly well. And then we get to jump into our second series in our first slate of games, and it's a matchup between Disguised and Cincinnati Fear. A really intriguing matchup on paper. Was really excited to see these two teams go head-to-head, especially with Fear looking so good right now. But Disguised has definitely gotten their form back. They get a 2-0 series win here, giving Fear another loss on the year. This is an unfortunate circumstance for them because it really felt like they were just starting to find some really good momentum, and they're going up against a Disguised team that has not been able to win 2-0 basically to save their lives in recent weeks, but this was the DSG that we really wanted to see in recent weeks. This is the team and the connection that we were kind of looking for. They looked phenomenal in this series. A couple of players in particular, too, that I really want to point out on the side of DSG that really led to this 2-0 series win. First of all, my player of the series, Meech in the bot lane. He can have some phenomenal games. We've talked about that a lot, but going up against a bot lane that has really kind of shown that they aren't great in terms of absorbing pressure, at least early on in the split, in Manui and JJ, they haven't necessarily clicked in that same way that Manui and Trevor did last split, in my opinion. Meech was definitely able to take advantage of that. His mechanics are just out of this world when he is on fire, and especially when you give him an opportunity to get that gold and kind of generate a lead for himself. He's just unstoppable. He looks so good in this matchup and was a really easy choice for player of the series. But man, I would be remiss to not mention Fake God up in the top side as well, who was just fantastic, especially in that game number 2. Fake God continues to look like probably the best top laner, although, like I said, Bradley is definitely giving him a run for his money at the current moment in the NACL. Those two players were really the ones that I think stepped up the most and really stood out to me as having great performances, and that was always going to be a concern when it came to Fear. Not that I'm saying that top and bot lane are quote-unquote their weaknesses, but they're certainly the positions that I think raise the most amount of question marks and have been the biggest questions so far in this split, and I think DSG was definitely prepared to take advantage of that. Really good stuff from Meech, really good stuff from Fake God. And if they're going to be able to keep this kind of play up, like, this is going to be a very scary DSG team. This is what we wanted to see out of them basically the entire year. Tomio was really good, definitely the better jungler here. I still think Young has a little bit of room to grow. I think he's been a little bit too inconsistent for my liking in the mid lane matchup, but going into someone like Shochi, who's just been phenomenal across this entire split, I'm willing to cut him a little bit of slack. I really do think the side lanes were massive for DSG, though, and they clearly showed their superiority in this one. And then for Fear on the other side, it's a frustrating loss because of the momentum that it really felt like they were starting to build, because of the way that they had begun to start playing in recent weeks. It felt like they were figuring stuff out and starting to get to that point where they could compete near the top of the standings, and then this series kind of hit like a truck, if I'm being entirely honest. It is against DSG, who is one of, if not the single most talented team on paper in the entire league, and so you don't want to sit there and be like, oh no, you know, it's a disaster, they shouldn't have lost this or anything. It's okay to have a loss like this, but there are definitely some pointers that I think think, some points in the game that I think I want to point out. Manui in particular, I think, had a pretty rough series, and this is just unfortunate. I really do think that Meech is a very good player and obviously incredibly mechanically talented, but Manui just has not been the same, I guess, consistent force that he was in spring. I don't want to say that he was bad in spring either, because again, I don't think he was. He certainly got a ton better over the course of the split. By the time we were, near the end of the spring split, it felt like the confidence that he had gained allowed him to play at a really high level. Someone who was one of the more premier weak side bot laners in the league that could also play with resources, but it really doesn't feel like that has been the case anymore. It feels like, when teams want to dump pressure into the bot lane, it's been a little bit more of a problem, and I'm not sure if that's going to be Manui just not necessarily still being the same player, or more than likely it's just kind of a synergy thing with the rest of the team, or maybe JJ in the support position. Whatever it is, it just has not been nearly as cohesive at the beginning of this split. Hopefully he can kind of get back to that form. You're never going to rule anybody out at this level, and so we've seen Manui play well. I expect him to be able to get better, and I think, as long as he's got that confidence in himself, I think he's going to be fine. I just hope that games like this don't rattle him too much. But JJ continues to just be kind of whatever. He's been good as an engage tool, a couple of times for this team, and obviously there's probably some sort of impact in the shot calling department that JJ's always been good in for this team, but it's just kind of been whatever in the bot lane, which is definitely frustrating. And then Perry, unfortunately, had another series where he was just kind of relatively out-jungled, especially in that game 2, and that's going to happen every once in a while. I'm not expecting Perry to be perfect, but I do think he's been a little bit more inconsistent across the beginning of this split than what he was in spring. Again, the talent level, I think, of every team in the league has increased so much, in my opinion, that, having more inconsistent games, I think, is expected from players that were really good in spring, but I would like to see kind of that trend of him continuing to get better and better and not really flipping the game immediately. I would like to see that be a little bit more prevalent for this team. I still think Shochi's actually been really good, even in their losses. He's been more than competent in the mid lane. I do think he could have been a little bit more active, but there's only so much you can do in the mid lane position in a series like this. And in general, I think Fear, is still a really good team, and they kind of just ran into a brick wall in DSG, but you do want to see a little bit more out of them. But for DSG, this was about exactly what you wanted to see. Really good performance from them to finally get a 2-0. And then we get to move into our second bracket of games here, and we get to kick it off with one of the more competitive series, if not the most competitive series of the entire week. We had Wildcard Gaming taking on FlyQuest Challengers, and it is a 1-1 split, where I really do think that both teams showed a lot of really good things across both games. Really excited for Wildcard. This is a team that I think I underestimated quite a bit going into the split. I expected some of their changes to not necessarily be positive. I thought that especially without Isles being here, this team was going to struggle a little bit more than maybe some of the other teams that were kind of, retaining a lot of talent or bringing in a lot of talent that definitely wanted to play together. It felt like Wildcard was a little bit more haphazardly put together, but they've actually been really competitive over the start of the split. One of the more interesting teams right there with like Taco and, a couple of the other, Fear, a couple of these other teams that have been, pretty interesting to talk about. And I think that's a really, really good thing, but FlyQuest is still FlyQuest. They certainly weren't going to get run over in this series, and a couple other players I still think played really well. Player of the series for me is going to stay on FlyQuest, and it's going to go to Yuji in the jungle. He's had a very, very good start to the split. This is basically exactly what we've wanted to see out of Yuji for quite a long time now. We've talked about him and Spirax as a really strong jungle mid duo. Spirax might be struggling a little bit out of the gate here in summer, but Yuji certainly is not. The aggressive tendencies that have gotten into trouble, at least a little bit in the past, are definitely still there. See game number 1 for a couple of the bad plays, but his game number 2 was like actually phenomenal. It was really one of the most impressive games that we saw in the entire week, and that's really what he's getting player of the series for. I think you could say a very similar thing about the opposing jungler in Keel, who had a great game 1, but just couldn't quite hold up in game number 2. It was really a battle of two good junglers going head to head here, and I think both of them honestly looked good, and both of them showed what they can look like in their element, even against a very good rest of the team. But Yuji was definitely the standout member of FlyQuest for me. Done in the series is unfortunately also going to stay on FlyQuest, though. It's going to go to Faisal in the top lane, and I like Faisal. I really do. I like him a lot. And honestly, he didn't play particularly bad in this series. I can't remember a miserable play that he made or any sort of major advantage that he gave over, but I think almost everybody in this series, 9 of the members of this series, in my opinion, had very outstanding plays and really contributed a lot to the team's success, and Faisal was kind of the odd man out in that case. It felt like he was just kind of on his own island, doing his own thing, certainly the least impactful player across this entire series, in my opinion, and I think that that is unfortunately going to earn him dud of the series in a series where nobody really played bad, and so unfortunate stuff for Faisal. I think that there have been significantly worse series by, other players across this entire day, but, he's going to end up getting it because I think almost everybody else played relatively well here, but Yuji continuing to look good, and I think he plays off the rest of this team well. And then for Wildcard, I think almost everybody on this team looked really good. Saligo was definitely the standout member for me in this series. He continues to be a rock in the mid lane for Wildcard. Him and Keel play off of each other so well, but Saligo's consistency, I think, is just super underrated. I know a lot of people were mad when I put him so high in my mid lane rankings, but he's just been a very good player at this level for so long, and he continues to be a positive for this team. He was the better mid laner in this series, and it was quite fun to watch. Keel, like I said before, was really good in that game number 1, was able to generate a massive lead over a struggling UG, and then obviously things kind of flipped in game number 2, but still having that really good game 1 was solid. And I think Lens and Dombre down in the bot lane were also really solid. And so Wildcard honestly just looking good against an actually good FlyQuest team. This looks like a team that can be competitive right up there with some of the other more interesting teams in the league at the current moment. And I think if they can continue on the stretch that they're on, they could be a top 5, maybe even at best top 4 kind of team moving into the back half of the split. But FlyQuest is still good. They showed a lot of good signs. A lot of their players are stepping up. It's the consistency, especially coming out of the solo laners, that you really need to see if they want to be one of the best teams in the league. It's great that they're able to look good in a couple of games here or there, but like we said about DSG, I want to see it in almost every single game before I truly believe you're one of the top teams in the entire league. And then moving into our second of the second slate games here on day 2, we had a matchup between Supernova and Evil Geniuses challengers that was split 1 apiece from both teams, a 1-1 draw. And I think Supernova, again, very much like I said it earlier, is going to take a result like this. EG is, for all of their flaws, still an incredibly talented team that everybody basically has to prepare for when they go up against them, because if you don't, they have enough talent to just kind of be able to run you over. They make some pretty big macro mistakes at some point in every single game, and some of these players are relatively inconsistent, but you definitely still have to be wary of them. So for Supernova to be able to walk out of this with a game 1 win, I think was really solid, especially in a matchup where they really limited a lot of the aggressive plays that Evil Geniuses wanted to make, but EG was able to bounce back and have a really good game 2, really with 2 of their main players stepping up and looking fantastic. Let's go ahead and talk about that. My player of the series is going to go to King in the bot lane for Evil Geniuses. He's still a really good player. I know King isn't exactly on the highest of priority lists for a lot of analysts right now in the NACL with so many attractive young bot lane options, but King is still really good, and he's still somebody who's going to be successful at this level, in my opinion. Very similar to Arrow. I think he's just a player that is incredibly solid and definitely gives some consistency to a team that desperately needs it. He's been good this year so far, but this is probably his best series up until this point. He looked really good against Sketch in this matchup in particular, and that Ezreal in game number 2 was actually phenomenal. I mean, there was legitimately some plays where I was like, nobody else in the NACL makes a play like this. That quadra kill at Baron was huge, and it actively won Evil Geniuses the game, and so really good stuff coming out from King. You really want to see him continue to look good on this team, especially because he couldn't play at all in spring, so to see him play well in summer, I think is definitely a good sign. But you want to give a big shout out to Shaden in the jungle as well. I've talked about him a lot, basically in every single Evil Geniuses series across this entire year, but either for positive or for negative reasons. He's been a big positive in a lot of their wins, and when he looks good, he looks great, and we saw that a little bit in spring, but for the most part in spring, it was a little bit of a regression from him. Those aggressive plays not necessarily working out, and him kind of being a little bit of a hindrance towards this team's success chances, but he was really good in this series. A great game 2 coming out from him to really set King up and allow him to kind of play the game that he wanted to play. That's what we're kind of looking for out of him. We just need him to be good enough for him to be able to pull the rest out. Now, the rest of this team was good. I think Smoothie was all right, but I do think that Ryoma in the mid lane was fine. I think my big concern for this team continues to be in the top lane here with Soul, and I just don't really know why Soul is struggling so much in lane. I don't know if it's a mental thing. I don't really know what it is. Quacker is a good player. I'm not going to try and understate that. I've been very impressed by what I've seen out of him at the start of this split, but Soul should not be losing as convincingly as he did in this series. He really had no impact on a lot of the positive fights that this team was having, and I was really disappointed that we really didn't see the version of him that I think we've seen in recent years so far on Evil Geniuses. I don't know if it's the org, I don't know if it's the specific combination of players, but it just doesn't feel like his confidence in his head is in the game at the current moment. So he's going to get my dud of the series, but for the most part, I would be pretty happy about this series if I was an Evil Geniuses fan. Maybe you want to take both, but I think a lot of the players that you wanted to see do well did step up. And then for Supernova on the other side, I actually think they looked relatively fine as well, especially this jungle mid duo, where I think a lot of the positives are going to come from. Music and Robbie Bob, I think, do have relatively good chemistry together. I like Music as a player and as a little bit of a prospect. I think he's got pretty crazy upside. When he wins incredibly hard. It's just going to be about finding the consistency with him. He can be exploited in the early game, as we've seen when he goes up against some of the more consistent junglers in the league. Players like Perry, I think, definitely showed that you can kind of exploit his pathing a little bit, but if he can get that part of the game down, if he can be a little bit more consistent, then I think that he's going to be a very scary threat at this level, maybe in a year or so's time. And then Robbie Bob is still good. I think, I've been a little bit lower. I can say maybe maybe a lot bit lower on him than maybe some other analysts across this year so far. Really have not been super pleased with what we've seen, but he was really good in this series, and honestly, in game number 1, he was a big reason why they were able to take that game. So Music and Robbie Bob looking good, but the rest of the team is just kind of meh right now. Sketch has definitely not impressed nearly as much as he did at the beginning of the split so far this week, and has been a little bit of a hindrance for this team. Maybe not a hindrance, but I just need him to step up and be like a big carry for this team, and then I'm going to feel good. And Trevor, I just don't think was as explosive as he was in their first game, but Quacker looked good in the top lane, and like I said, Jungle Mid being a positive is good for Supernova overall. It just feels like these two teams are both kind of in a state of limbo right now. Supernova definitely wants to be able to kind of find out what they have, especially in their Jungle Mid duo, and the rest of the team is just kind of there. Quacker's been good, but bot lane's been a little bit up and down, and I just don't know if I have a ton of confidence that this team is going to be able to consistently win games. And then for Evil Geniuses, you have no idea what you're ever going to get with this team. Are they going to be good? Are they going to be bad? Who knows? They're going to take games off the best teams in the league. They're going to lose games to the worst teams in the league. That's just how it goes, but EG is just one of those teams where you're hoping that the development of the players is going to take a paramount focus. And then our final series of day number 2 here, and it was a really intriguing matchup between two teams that have gotten better recently in Team Fish Taco and Maryville University, and it is a 1-1 split. Both of these teams showing that same record, same mentality, I think, at the current moment. Both are kind of interesting. I think Taco has maybe shown a little bit more over the course of the beginning part of this split against some better teams, but Maryville has definitely stepped it up in recent weeks after a pretty rough week number 1, and so definitely some positives to take away. My player of the series is going to go to Odd Orange in the jungle. Like I said before, he's really been the guy for Maryville in the NACL, in my opinion. I wasn't exactly sure what to expect out of him. He is somebody who has succeeded and been okay at this level before, but it's been so long that you really never know that transition back. A lot of these players are so different. The talent level, in my opinion, in Tier 2 has increased so much over the past couple of years that Odd Orange was always going to be a question mark on whether or not he was going to be able to step up, but he's actually been phenomenal. One of the more consistent junglers in the entire NACL, in my opinion, and I did not have that on my bingo card. Not that I thought he was bad. Again, nobody in the NACL is bad, but Odd Orange being fantastic like he has been, I think, is a really big positive for Maryville overall. We talk about how he likes to play towards topside, and that definitely wasn't, not the case in this series. Niles definitely got a lot of support, but I think Jerry and Getback have been a lot more successful in terms of their ability to 1v1 or 2v2 in their individual lanes than I expected, and I think that's helped Odd Orange out a lot. Now, obviously, his early game pressure has been phenomenal for this team, and hopefully he can be able to keep that up, but I think he really does play off of his lanes almost better than any other jungler at this level. And then, like I said, those lanes were really good. Jerry and Niles in particular, the side lanes, I think looked really good. Niles continues to do well with a lot of attention, especially in this game number 2 that he was able to win, but he was fine in game number 1 as well. Certainly wasn't the biggest problem. And then Scary Jerry continues to also be a really good player when he's given the opportunity to just kind of play the game, when there's not too much responsibility on him. I think as a young player, sometimes there can be some opportunities that are maybe a little bit too much for him. Asking him to dominate a 2v2 at this level consistently is just going to be very difficult, especially into a player like Spawn, who's just so experienced at playing at this level, but asking him to be really good in team fights, now that's something he can do, especially when the team has a lead. And so game 2 just felt like a full, I would say, kind of story for this team, and I think they look good. If there was a negative for me in game number 1, it was Getback in the mid lane, but again, he's been relatively fine for this team outside of week number 1, and so I'm willing to give him a little bit of a pass. I think Maryville honestly kind of looked like the better team in this series, and that's definitely an impressive thing to say considering how good Taco has looked, but Taco's still able to pull out that first game, and you've got to be excited for them. My player of the game in game number 1 would have been Onat, who continues to be a really big positive for this team in the mid lane. He really gapped Getback, in my opinion, and his laning has been very impressive, but he's a good team fighter. He knows exactly where he needs to be on the map. I like to see him on these more scaling-oriented carries because I do think that that's how Taco is going to win more consistently, but he can be a shove and roam facilitating type of mid laner as well. Just a very versatile player that I think this team is very happy to have, but the rest of the team maybe a little bit more up in the air, especially in that second game. Dud of the series for me is going to go to Lunacia. That Renekton game in game 2 in particular was just not very fun to watch. He's going to have games like this. Again, we know what Lunacia is. He's going to dominate like he did on day number 1 and just absolutely tear apart players that aren't ready, and then he's also going to have games where he's just kind of running it and isn't very useful on a champion that needs to win early. And that's kind of what happened in this one. And so you're going to have the back and forth performances. He needs to be able to clean that up, but it's just kind of what we've come to expect from him as a top laner at this point. And then I was a little bit disappointed in NXI. I really wanted to see a little bit more out of him. He was actually super intriguing to me in week number 1. I mean, I think he led the entire league in kill participation and was looking really, really aggressive and fun. And on these hook champions, he was looking very, aggro, and he was moving around with this jungle, and he was very active on the map. that, just everything you wanted to see out of a support, especially a role-swapped jungler, kind of using that macro advantage. But it's kind of cooled off a bit, and this was a little bit of a rough series. I definitely think that bot lane was in favor of Maryville, and a lot of that was NXI, in my opinion. But this team is still solid. This team is still good. Taco's momentum has maybe cooled off a little bit more than I would have liked to see, but I still believe in them to be one of the more interesting middle-tier teams in the entire league, and I still think they can be a lot of fun. They just need to get better performances out of some of their more inconsistent players. But for Maryville, I mean, this team's red hot right now, if I'm being honest. Like, I know their record doesn't necessarily show that, but they've been taking games off of teams that are playing well and looking good while doing it. I think especially this jungle position's been a major positive, and if you can get good performances out of your laners, I think Maryville could be a team to continue to watch. I really overreacted when I said that they were going to be the worst team in the NACL after week number 1. It really does feel like they're continuing to get better. And then moving on to our third and final day of the week here in the NACL for week number 3, and we get to kick it off with our first slate of games, and with probably the least competitive series that we're going to cover all week. We had a matchup between Supernova and Disguised, and DSG is on track. If we were worried about this team not being able to 2-0 weaker opponents with consistency, I think that has kind of been thrown out the window after the last couple of series. They looked really good against Fear, and man, they decimated Supernova. This was the least close series that I watched the entire week of basically any region. DSG looked so good in this series, and it was all 5 members. I have written in my notes, usually the players that I want to talk about and like the mainstays, I just have DSG written. That's really where we were at in this series, where everyone played out of their minds. Obviously, 2 combined kills for Supernova in 2 games is not particularly good, but I honestly think it was even more dominant than that. Watching these games, there was just no pressure. It was all DSG all of the time, and you've got to give a lot of congratulations to this team for being able to accomplish that. They were really, really good, but player of the series for me was kind of difficult to do because honestly everybody played well, but I'm going to land on it being Zazel in the support position, mostly because I feel like he deserves a little bit more credit for how good this team has been over the beginning part of the split, especially with the form that they're currently gathering at the moment. It feels like DSG is definitely starting to pick up momentum, and a lot of that is the consistency that Zazel offers. As good as Meech has been, and I definitely want to talk about him in a second because he was fantastic in this series, Zazel's also been just as good, and this team I think really would be a lot worse if they had a more inexperienced and less consistent support in that position. And so overall, I really, really like what he's been able to do, and I wanted to give him his flowers a bit here because he did play well in this series as well. But Meech was fantastic, ended up solo killing Sketch in that second game just with the Felios rotation because that's just how that champion works from ahead. But man, like, this bot lane was dominant. Top lane was a disaster, especially in game number 2 for Supernova. Disguised Fake God in particular, turning around a potential dive on the top side to end in a 2-for-1 that just ended Supernova's game basically on the spot. Music not having a very good series in general, but we'll talk about that in a second. Quacker kind of getting caught out and then eventually getting camped in the top side to end up losing that, so they lost that. Mid lane was a disaster just in the 1v1, and that was probably the most noticeable, like, individual player gap was Young and Robbie Bob. I think you could also say the same thing for Meech and Sketch in this series, and so it really was just kind of brutal. There really isn't a lot of analysis that I can give you. Disguised was phenomenal, and they just kind of took Supernova to town here. And then Supernova on the other side just looked completely incompetent in this game. It's going to happen every once in a while. You're going to have a couple of bad games, especially against a good team, but I would have hoped to at least seen some level of fire. At least this team was trying to make plays. A lot of the negative, major consequences that they ended up suffering throughout this series were because they were trying too hard to make some aggressive plays. Music invading in game number 1, getting caught out and dying, or just that dive on the top side that ends up not working out for them. At the very least, they're attempting to do something, but these plays are so low, like, success chance that I really don't want them to go for these kinds of plays. You want to see them go for plays that have the opportunity to actually move the needle in a very positive way if they work. These were low upside and massive, massive, massive risks that they ended up taking in this game, and it just wasn't going to work out. Just really weird game plan, but Supernova definitely needs to figure stuff out. You can give dud of the series to any of them. Literally any of the 5 members. None of them played well. I'm going to give it to Robbie Bob because, like I said, I just wanted to see him do anything in the series, and he didn't do anything. Got outplayed by Young in the mid lane, most notably in the 1v1, but Quacker went for a ton of plays on the top side that didn't end up working, but he was both of their kills in this series, so it was kind of hard for me to, give that to him. You could give it to Music for basically throwing away game number 1, and a little bit of game number 2. You could give it to anybody in the bot lane for just kind of losing super hard in the 2v2. This was just not a good series for Supernova. Consider this a team-wide dud of the series, and consider this a team-wide player of the series for DSG as well. This was a stomp and a shellacking, and it was kind of fun to watch in that sense, but certainly not a lot we can take from it. And then moving on to our second series here of the first slate of games, we had Wildcard Gaming taking on Cincinnati Fear. And Wildcard picking up kind of a shocking 2-0 win here. It shouldn't be too shocking, though, because this team has consistently been very good over the course of the beginning of this split. They've been one of the more interesting teams to watch in the entire league, and I think this really seals it for me. This is kind of looking like a top 4 team right now, which I don't think a lot of people were expecting moving into this split. So you got to be incredibly excited for what Wildcard has been able to do. Of course, Fear kind of stumbling a little bit more than they have in previous series here. Had a really good week 2, had a rough week 1, and up and down, I would say, week number 3. And so some good and some bad to take away for this team, but I still feel pretty confident that they're going to be able to figure things out. But let's talk about Wildcard first and foremost, because they were able to pick up the 2-0 series win here. And really, again, it's the whole team. There wasn't one individual player, in my opinion, that was standing out more than others. This was a team performance coming in from Wildcard, and you've got to be excited about that, but I do have to give out a player of the series, and you know, for me, if I can, I'm going to give it to the support. I'm going to give it to Donbray, who just continues to look really good for this team. I know a lot of people really like Duo King. I know he's really popular in the community, but I think Donbray's been better for this team by a lot, to be honest, over the last 2 weeks. I think he's been very positive in terms of what they've been able to do, both him and Lenz in the bot lane. And he's really active. He moves around the map. He's really good in the 2v2. I just kind of like him as a player. I think he's very much fit into this team very well and been a more than suitable kind of, I don't want to call him like a placeholder because I feel like that's disrespectful to the way that he's been playing. But, you know, if you are waiting on Isles to come in here and play support, Donbray is more than good enough to be able to carry you across the finish line in case that never happens. And so a good series from him. Saligo just continues to be really good. He was fantastic across this entire week, and he's a big reason why I think Wildcard has been so good. As much as I love Keel, and as much as I really do think he's kind of the heartbeat of this team, I think, like, Saligo's the brain, right? He's the thing that keeps the team grounded in terms of all the decisions that they make. He's just been so consistently good in and out of lane. Doesn't really, like, perfectly excel in any one area. I don't think he's the single best player in the league at any one thing in terms of his position, but he's just really good at everything, and that makes him a very dangerous player to play into. He was definitely the better mid laner in this series in particular, but like I said, it really was the entirety of Wildcard. Everybody on this team played well, whether it was Zamudo, whether it was Lenz, whether it was Keel. You know, everybody else also picked up the slack. I just think Donbray and Saligo were definitely the two players that were the most noticeable to me, and I really wanted to give them a lot of credit in particular. But let's go ahead and talk about Fear, because it's another one of the rough series that they've had over the course of this year, and it just kind of feels like sometimes they're going to come out and have these. They feel like a relatively inconsistent team at the current moment, and the unfortunate part is, for me, my dud of the series is going to go to Shochi in the mid lane, who it just didn't feel like had a ton of pressure. He had been basically perfect. I'm not going to say perfect, but really, really good over the beginning part of the split. He had been by far this team's most consistent player, in my opinion, and then you're going to have some games like this. This was probably his worst series of the split up until this point. Saligo just had significantly more pressure coming out of that mid lane spot, and I think Shochi really struggled to be able to match that. You're going to have games like this every once in a while, and it's totally okay to have games like this every once in a while, but it is worth noting that the rest of the team wasn't exactly there to make it easier. I would say Perry definitely had some good moments in this series, and he was probably the most flashy member of Fear, but there were also some unfortunate moments as well. I just think he was probably the best performing member. Bot lane continues to be a question mark for me. Manui had another kind of rough series here, and again, it's going to happen. Donbray played really well and kind of stopped Manui from doing a lot of the things that he wanted to do from my perspective, but man, the consistency is just a little bit of an issue. It very much feels like if the team is playing well, this bot lane plays well, and if the team isn't playing well, the bot lane doesn't play well, and that's kind of an unfortunate thing in a meta where it's very bot lane focused. We've seen that this team can play through, you know, jungle mid and be able to win a lot of games through that, but bot lane's been relatively inconsistent, and so when you have a poor series like is going to happen from your mid laner every so often, like, it just doesn't feel like the team is going to be able to pick up that slack, and that's the unfortunate part. Again, there's Phillips on this team. I don't think I mentioned him a single time this week because I don't really think he made any sort of like standout play. Again, I don't think he's been awful, but I certainly don't think he's been pushing this team forward. It really does feel like either Perry and Shochi win the game for the team or they lose and this team loses, and it's kind of an unfortunate thing to be stuck in right now, which is this state of you really hope the rest of the team can solidify, because we know these players are good, we know they can step up, but it really does feel like a lot of pressure is being put on a small group of players for Fear, and I think that could be a dangerous setting moving into the second half of this split. But for Wildcard, really, really, really good series. This team just looks so good right now. I mean, they really are just playing fantastic. As much as I can hype up teams like Taco and teams like Maryville that I think have been performing a lot better as of recent, Wildcard is that team that is outside of the top 3 that I think is really impressing a lot of people right now. And honestly, I think you could make a solid case that they are probably, at the moment, the best of the bunch. And then moving on to our second slate of games here on the final day, we get to kick it off with a little bit of an upset here as we saw Maryville University taking on FlyQuest Challengers, and Maryville with a 2-0 series win, not just a game, but both games over FlyQuest. A rough week for FlyQuest just in general. So many things that I wish they showed that they just didn't quite show in this one that were a little bit disappointing, and a couple of players that I'm not super sold on when it comes to this team. I don't think that they're nearly as well-rounded as the other top teams in the league at the current moment, and I think it's kind of being taken advantage of even by some teams that aren't necessarily considered on the same level as them, like Maryville in this series, who looked really, really good. Finally, a series that I can talk about all of the players when it comes to Maryville. I'm obviously excited to talk about Odd Orange a ton, but I feel like he's really the only member of this team that I've mentioned in a super positive light over the course of this year so far, and so to get a chance to mention the side lanes, I think is really, really a positive. I really struggled with player of the series because, man, I really wanted to give this to two members. It's going to go to Niles in the top lane because I do feel like he made more flashy plays, and that honestly took a little bit of precedent for me. People are going to notice him a bit more in terms of what he was able to do. Faisal obviously struggled, especially in that game number 1, and Niles was a big reason why that Pantheon is a super big pick for this team, and it's clearly, working in terms of being able to generate early game leads. It's worked in basically every game they've played it in. But Scary Jerry was also, genuinely phenomenal. I know his over-aggressive tendencies got him into trouble at least a little bit in this series. He led the entire team in deaths. But man, his good plays were better than anything that this team did, and he was the one that they were willing to play through. And if you want to give player of the series to Jerry, absolutely, I completely agree. It was super fun to watch in this. The aggressive tendencies, I'm more than willing to kind of give over some of these deaths if it means these positive plays that he ends up making. You don't want to see a young player and an inexperienced player at this level playing scared. That's something you don't want to see, and he was certainly not playing scared against a good team and arguably the best bot lane in the entire NACL, and so that was really good. But Niles, Jerry, whoever you want to give player of the series to, they both kind of deserve it in this one. But Zyko also really, really good. You can't have a really good AD carry performance without the support stepping up at least a little bit. I really like Zyko, and it really does feel like Maryville is clicking on a level that they just didn't at the beginning of the split, which is not what we expected for this team. We thought they would start hot because of the synergy that they had inbuilt, not switching out any of these players, but really, it was just them taking a little bit of time to get used to Tier 2, and I think obviously Odd Orange was great here too. Basically everybody was good. Get Back was probably the least flashy player in the series, but he was still solid in the mid lane, and Maryville in general looks like they're finding their groove right now, and it's really fun to watch. But basically the opposite can be said for FlyQuest. I actually really have not been impressed with what I've been able to see from this team this week. They didn't really play all that well, and a lot of the players that we were really hyping up certainly did not meet expectations in my opinion. Yuji was really good across this week, but I don't really think anybody else kind of impressed me all that much. Faisal's gonna get another dud of the series for me. Again, just kind of got outplayed, especially in that game 1 by Niles. Really could not keep up with the really aggressive pick in the top lane, and sometimes that's going to happen, but I think Faisal was just maybe a little bit overhyped coming into this team, and I hate saying that because I like him a lot as a player, but Fear had something special last split. Clearly, they're not doing as well without him, and it doesn't seem like he's doing as well without them, and so very unfortunate to see that end up happening. You hate to see two sides go, part their ways and both kind of be worse off for it, but that kind of feels like the case right now, especially in lane for Faisal. But we gotta be honest, Masu was also not very good in this series. He was outplayed by Scary Jerry, very consistently across this entire series, and that's a concern because Masu needs to be the guy in order for this team to be at the level that they want to be at. Masu has kind of struggled out of the gate in terms of what he's been able to do in Summer Split, at least in comparison to expectations. He certainly hasn't been awful, but he really has not been a game wrecker, and that's certainly something to keep in mind. I think Winsome is still a really good player, but if Masu kind of regresses more towards the mean rather than what he was a lot of the time in spring, especially when he got off of Ping, it's definitely going to be disappointing because it looked like we had a superstar at the NACL level, someone who could step into the LCS basically immediately, and it just doesn't feel like we have that right now, at least in terms of how he's been playing. Of course, he can still find that form, and he's still mechanically talented, but FlyQuest got outplayed in this series, and there's really no other way to say it. This team kind of struggled quite a bit in week number 3, and hopefully they can figure out what the problem is and move forward into the second half of the split feeling better. But congratulations to Maryville. They're definitely finding their form, and they genuinely look like one of the scarier middle-tier teams right now. And then we move on to our second of the second slate here, and we get to keep the 2-0 train rolling as we saw Team Fish Taco taking on AoE Gold, and AoE picking up a 2-0 win. They desperately needed this. I was really starting to be out on this team. I was considering putting them near the bottom, if not at the bottom of my power rankings. They had looked very inconsistent over basically the entire split up until this point, and really it never felt like they had a lot of control over the map. But going up against a Fish Taco team that has shown some good things, especially in recent weeks, it's really good to see see AoE step up and be able to play them in a very tough way. It felt like everybody was basically playing well for this Taco team, and that's very, very exciting to see. Or not Taco, I should say for AoE, and that's very exciting to see. Player of the series, again, very much like the series we just covered, was kind of difficult for me because there were two players that really stood out as being fantastic in this series, but maybe surprisingly, I'm going to give it to Will in the jungle, who I think really has been the rock of this team. He's had a couple of up and down performances, mostly on the AD carry, when he shouldn't have been in that, an unfortunate situation, obviously, with Lynx, but, you know, when he's in the jungle position, he's been this team's best player by a considerable amount, and it's really good to see because he was a player that had so much hype behind him just a couple of years ago, and so to see him, you know, return to the league here and get, you know, so much form back so quickly and be such a positive for a team that is kind of struggling, I think is a really positive thing for AoE and for Will in general. I'm going to give him player of the series because I think his setups were great. His ability to control the map, I think, is really what created the advantages that AoE used to win the games, especially in game number 1, and then his team fighting is phenomenal. He's just a very well-rounded player that can kind of do it all, and to be able to do it on things like Sejuani that people were concerned he wasn't going to be as good on is just a very, very good sign from him and from this team in general, but Darkwings as well is the other player that you simply have to give a lot of credit to. As much as Will was setting a lot of things up in this series, somebody had to capitalize on it, and that was going to be Darkwings. Whether it was on the Tristana, whether it was on the Cassiopeia, both of those games were super good from Darkwings, and man, did I need this performance. I was starting to sour quite a bit on Darkwings. His laning had really decreased, in my opinion, and I think his ability to impact the game in the mid-game had really decreased, and wasn't playing off Will particularly well, and so I needed to see a performance where he just got up and really dominated, and this was it. Really, really good stuff coming in from him. That jungle mid duo was a positive, but Lynx and Breezy were also really good. I'm praising Breezy a lot on this channel because I do think that he has been incredibly underrated for the impact that he's been able to have on these games. He's arguably been the most consistent member of AoE. He was really good in week number 1, and he's been nothing but a positive for this team, in my opinion. Lynx was really good in this series, and then, of course, Concept on the top side was good enough. You just need to not lose the game. That's what he did for Golden Guardians Challengers last year, was just not lose. And it allowed the rest of the team to be able to do their thing, and I think it's going to be a similar thing here for AoE Gold. And right now, that jungle mid duo at least looked really good in this series. And then for Taco on the other side, kind of the opposite. Top side of the map was really not the positive for them. Dud of the series for me, pretty obviously going to go to Rosethorn. 16 deaths across 2 games. There were some really good plays from him that kept TFT in the game, but man, I mean, the bad plays were tremendous, and there were so many of them. He just was very inconsistent across the series, and that's really the word that you can use to describe Rosethorn, is inconsistent. Is he going to have a good series? Is he going to have a bad series? I have no idea. There are some series that are kind of like that, and, you know, you get the good, and you take the good with the bad, and yada, 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 but Rosethorn, I think, has been a little bit more of the negative this split than you want to see, and that was something I was really worried about with this team. When I was previewing them in the preseason, I was worried that Rosethorn wasn't quite going to click in that same way, and that's kind of been the case. Lunacia also had a really poor game number 2. It happens, right? Lunacia is going to have bad games. It's going to happen every once in a while, but everybody kind of got outplayed in this one. I just think topside was the most noticeable in my opinion, so very good win for AoE, but Taco was really on a roll, and it's got to be really frustrating to see them not be able to capitalize in a series like this. And then we move into the final series of the week here, and it is a battle between 2 LCS Challengers teams. We had Team Liquid Challengers taking on Evil Geniuses Challengers, and for the first time on day 3, it is a 1-1 split. We finally got a 1 game apiece, and honestly, this is not the series I expected that to be. Team Liquid looked like they were running through everybody in the league up until this point, and Evil Geniuses had been on kind of a downward trajectory, but I think you can make a real argument that EG was the better team in this series, and that's definitely not what I expected, but that's Evil Geniuses for you, especially their Challengers team just throwing all of the expectations into the wind to get the most surprising result. But EG actually played really well, in my opinion, and it was 2 players that I've already talked about quite a bit this week. In particular, my player of the series, King, in the bot lane, who, you know, I know a lot of people are going to be anti-veteran and anti, players who have been given opportunities at this level, but King has shown pretty much every time he's had the opportunity that he is more than good enough to be able to get teams across the finish line at this level. He had a phenomenal week, multiple games. I know EG didn't win everything this week, but almost every single one of their wins you could almost single-handedly dedicate to King, and that's a really impressive thing to say. He's just been really good for this team, and he's going to fly under the radar because Evil Geniuses is kind of not the most flashy and fun team to watch at the current moment, but King is a real treat right now, and he's really playing at a high level. Someone who I've always been a fan of, and who I always think if, given a better opportunity than maybe what he got at the LCS level, could actually be a really solid player, but it's just unfortunate the way things have kind of ended up for him in terms of his LCS career. But it wasn't just him. Shaden had another really good series, and that's really what you're going to need for Evil Geniuses. When Shaden plays well, they're likely going to be able to take down almost anybody in the league. His talent level is through the roof, especially compared to a lot of other junglers here at the NACL level. individually, and so really good to see him perform well, and really good to see him play off the bot lane well. I think that's really been the most positive trait, is he had trouble, I think, integrating himself with the team in spring, but King entering this roster, I think, has helped him a lot. It gives him that consistency that he can play for in the bot lane in the early game, and it gives him someone in the late game that can kind of bail him out if the games are relatively even. He doesn't have to do everything in team fights, which I think is a really big positive. So King, Shaden, definitely the more noticeable parts, but topside's still a little bit of a concern. Soul wasn't miserable in this series. He was definitely the better top laner in my opinion, but you still want to see him be a little bit more aggressive, and I like him as a player, but you can have some up and down weeks, and it's fair to say this was a little bit of a down week, but for Team Liquid on the other side, APA continues to be their guy. I can't remember a series outside of that one random one last week where APA wasn't very good for this team. He's just the best mid laner in the region by a considerable margin, and there's basically nobody that can go up against him in the laning phase, and it's really impressive to see. He was definitely the best member of TL, and he was definitely the player of the game in game number 1, but I do have to point out, Bradley had a rough series here. He was definitely kind of bad in game number 2, and you can make the argument that his Scion was single-handedly losing them the game a lot of parts of game number 2, and so he's going to get my dud of the series. Still had a really good week overall. 2 player of the series, 1 dud of the series. That's just kind of the dichotomy of being a really aggressive top laner, but it's just unfortunate that he couldn't quite close out the week that he'd been playing so well with a more dominant performance. It was more of a whimper towards the end, but I still like Bradley a lot as a player. I still think he's going to be a big positive for this team as they move forward. It was just a little bit of an unfortunate way to end the week here with a rough Scion game, but Team Liquid is still good. It's frustrating that I think they weren't able to take both games here, but at least being able to take one is definitely a positive, and the dominance that you were able to show not only over this week, but over multiple weeks is more than enough to build the confidence that this is more of an outlier than them, winning 2-0 every single week. And then for EG, you got to be super happy with this result. This week had been kind of disastrous for them up until this point, but this kind of game is the one that really kind of puts it into perspective of there still is a lot of talent on this team. There really is a lot of positives, especially in terms of what they're able to offer now, especially if that jungle position can step up. This team can actually be very good like we all thought they would be at the beginning of the split, and they might not be on a complete downturn like we all thought they would be, considering what they did in spring. All right, but that is going to do it for my NACL Week 3 overview and analysis of all 3 days. Up on the screen now, you're going to see the updated NACL standings after 3 weeks of action. There are no ties anymore. We're at the point where pretty much everybody has separated themselves, so no spiel there. Of course, in the first column to the right, you're going to see my updated power rankings. In the second column, you're going to see how those have changed from last week to this week. So let's go over the risers and the fallers. Top 3 is staying the top 3, but there is some movement. Disguised is jumping back up to number 2. Fly is dropping back down to number 3. Feel like this is really only fair at this point. Fly is very much on the cusp of dropping out of the top 3 if they continue to struggle as much as they did this week, but Disguise really started to figure things out going 5-1 this week, and Team Liquid is clearly the best team in the league still, and so top 3 feels pretty solidified, but Wildcard jumping up to number 4. They feel like the best of the rest at the current moment, especially with that win over Fear. It was a very, very good one, and it feels like this team is just playing well. Their mid-jungle duo is super consistent, and I really like what the spot lane has been able to do, so hopefully they're able to keep it up. Fear drops down to number 5 because of it. I don't want to, overreact too much to some of their losses, but I do think they need to start showing some more consistency or else I'm going to be concerned. Evil Geniuses stay at number 6. Same thing with them. Some people are going to put them a lot lower. I'm going to continue to say that there's a chance that they continue to be relevant, although I wouldn't be shocked if they fall down to like number 8 next week if things continue to go bad. Maryville's going to jump all the way up to number 7 from number 10. They're clearly not one of the worst teams in the league. They are very competitive, and honestly, they could continue to rise if they play as well as they did this week. Taco stays at 8. They look good, but inconsistent. AoE and Supernova feel like the 2 worst teams in the league for me at the moment, so AoE drops to 9, Supernova drops to 10. Those are your bottom 2. Even with AoE being able to take down Taco, I don't expect that to be something consistent that they're going to be able to do over the course of the entire split, but those are my power rankings. Of course, let me know what you agree and disagree with down in the comment section below. Just be courteous about it. It's about having a conversation, not yelling an opinion at someone, but time to jump into my player of the week and my dud of the week, and it's a really interesting one because I don't really think there was any individual players that were great or awful this week, just kind of a lot of different showings from different teams, but my player of the week is going to shock some people. It is going to go to King, the 80 carry for Evil Geniuses Challengers. I thought King was actually fantastic this week. Pretty much every game that they won was almost single-handedly because King dragged them across the finish line, which makes this team interesting, but King had a great week and really showed that he deserves to still be here in the NACL. Really like what he was able to do and really like what he was able to kind of do for the rest of this team, because my dud of the week is actually going to stay on the same team for maybe the first time ever and go to Soul in the top lane, who I just think was relatively up and down. I'm going to say it here. It looks like he's not going to continue to be playing top lane for Evil Genius's challengers. That looks to be his decision, though, which is fine. You know, any sort of mental stuff. I mean, get yourself right. You always take care of yourself first. And especially, like, with this, we know it's not talent. We know he's good enough to be, like, really good at this level. It's just the confidence thing. Whether it's taking time off or whether it's a retirement, I wish him the best, and obviously I wish Evil Genius is the best, but wasn't a great week number 3 from him, and I would be remiss to give it to anybody else. So dud of the week for me in week number 3 is going to go to Soul, and player of the week is going to go to King. Again, let me know if I've ever done that before. I don't know if I've ever given a player of the week and a dud of the week to players on the same team, but certainly an interesting thing. But that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, let me know down in the comments section below. Of course, leave a like on the video. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content and helps get this video out to a lot more people. Of course, if you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We post about the NACL every single week on this channel, and not only the NACL, but we cover all 4 of the major regions as well. And so, comprehensive LoL esports coverage, that's what we do here. If you're interested in that, hit subscribe, hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all